In this video, I'll demonstrate the different ways that IntellisenseX produces drop-down lists of fields from tables. This is the third in the IntellisenseX series of videos. The first sample, which is the simplest, is where we have an open table named part list, and when we type the dot, we get the drop-down list of all the fields from that table and their data types and their widths. The second case is a little bit more interesting. In this case, we have a select statement and we have something called a local alias. Within the select statement, parts list is referred to by its local alias, and IntellisenseX is smart enough to recognize that and produce the same drop-down list from the table that this alias refers to. The third example is more interesting because in this case I'm looking at something called vendors, and vendors is not in the list of open tables, and yet when I type the dot I get the list of fields from the vendors table. What is happening here is that IntellisenseX tries 4 different ways to open that table. First, it tries to use the table. If there's a database open, it sees if that table is in the database. It looks in the data environment for the form, if there's a form open, and it also looks in the MRU list for tables that have been opened. If it finds it in any one of those 4 places, it opens the table. As you can see, it is now open, and produces the drop-down list. That may not be sufficient for your needs if you open tables in a different way than one of the 4 ways that I mentioned. For example, in my own application development, the tables that I open are never in the path and are instead opened by a procedure which knows where to find them. So what IntellisenseX does is, if none of these 4 possibilities work, it calls a plug-in PRG, which you can modify to fit your own needs, to open a table the way that you open a table. The mechanics of this are explained in detail in the 11th IntellisenseX video, but the concept is fairly easy. There's a plug-in PRG which is called with an alias name, and if the plug-in is able to open that table, it returns that alias as a result. That's all that it has to do. The next example is more intriguing. I have select inventory, and when I type a dot I get a drop-down list, but no inventory table is opened. That's because inventory is actually an SQL table, and what has happened is the structure for that table has been read, and that has been used to populate the drop-down list. Let me explain what's going on in the background. When you type a dot, IntellisenseX processes everything before the dot, in this case the word inventory, and it tries a number of possibilities about what inventory can mean, and the last thing that it does is it calls another custom plug-in PRG which allows you to interpret it any way you want to. In the case that I presented to you here, you're seeing what happens in my own personal case, in which I have a data dictionary of all my SQL tables, and I simply read from that data dictionary the list of fields and their structure, and then I populate an appropriate object to communicate this list of fields back to the calling program. Now, this could just as easily have been done. Instead of using a data dictionary, you could well have opened a connection to the SQL database and used SQL columns to retrieve the structure of the individual table. And the last example is most intriguing. This example is an extension of what I just told you, how where if IntellisenseX can't find the text that immediately precedes the dot, it calls a custom PRG in order to allow that PRG to do its work to find the list of fields for the table that it represents. Well, in this particular example, if I type a dot, amazingly, this produces a list of fields from a table. It's the customers table. And what is happening here is the following. In my environment, if I have a form which uses a business object, that business object is stored in this property. And the data object for that business object is stored in OData. This is a standard in all of my applications. And furthermore, there's a form property called CAlias, and the value of this property is the alias for the business object that I'm working on. So for this form, within this form.calias refers to a particular table, and whenever I see this particular structure, I know as a programmer that it refers to the customers table, and thus when I type the dot, I get the drop down for the customers table. The way this is handled is the plugin PRG that I just referred to is passed this entire text as a parameter, and a way to get at the properties of the form. So I have a parameter, this form.opbisobj.odata. I have the form that I'm working on. I can look at the CAlias property and learn it's the customers table that I'm referring to, and then I can produce the list of fields for that table. Of course, I'm not saying that you need to use this particular structure. This is an example of what can be done, and if you can find a way to programmatically recognize a phrase and associate it with a table, you can then use this plugin to produce the list of fields as a drop-down corresponding to that table. Now IntellisenseX not only can produce a list of fields, it also can produce lists of tables. So for instance, if you said select something from a database and you said DB exclamation point, and you're going to follow that with the name of a table in the database, you can use IntellisenseX by hotkey. And if we go up to the Thor launcher, and we see that that is the second tool under IntelliSense, IntellisenseX by hotkey, and I have assigned a hotkey to it called Control-I, the DB exclamation point, and now when I press Control-I, I get the list of fields and views from the currently open database. Similarly, if I just type the exclamation point, and if I use the same tool, I'll show that to you again, IntellisenseX by hotkey. When I do so, this is going to give me the list of, if there's a database open, all the tables and views from the database, and it also will show you any tables that are in the data environment. And the last of these special things that you can do with IntellisenseX by hotkey is if you say star and the hotkey, you'll get a drop-down list of all the tables that are in your path. So there are a few other videos that are of relevance here. You've just watched video 3. There's more on this in video 5 about indirect table and object references. And then there is the last video that I have referred to, number 11, which talks about the mechanics of using those two plugins that were referred to in this video.